And as Alka has indicated, the meeting is going to be recorded. So I just remind everyone that, remind everybody of that. And also, I'm going to ask Ms. Taylor to take the roll call to confirm that there is a quorum present.
Okay. Maureen Buttrell.
I'm here.
Rich Myers.
Here.
Jamie St. Clair.
Here.
All right, Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
All right, very good. Also, I'm going to ask everyone to mute their microphones when you're not speaking, and remind everyone that when you do speak, if you could state your name so that we have that for the recording, as well as so Ms. Taylor can record that for the, make sure that we have accurate notes for the purposes of these meetings. So the first order of business, of course, is going to be to adopt the agenda for the meeting. And you should have received a copy of the draft agenda that Ms. Taylor sent to you last Tuesday. So I will ask for a motion to adopt the draft agenda.
I move to, this is Maureen Bottrell. I move to adopt the agenda.
And a second.
This is Jamie. I move to second, or I second.
Okay. All right. And Ms. Taylor, can you please take a roll call to record the ayes and the nays?
All right, Maureen.
Yes, I agree.
Rich.
Yes.
Jamie.
Aye.
Okay, the
Motion passes. All right. So for the validations, the department is going to provide a brief summary of each, and then the members then can ask questions, provide comments, or make recommendations. So at this point, I would like to turn the meeting over to Program Manager Robin Weimer and Research Section Supervisor Dr. Wagner to lead the discussion.
Good afternoon, everybody. We will go through our different validations in order that they are seen on the draft agenda. I'm hoping that everyone is able to have time to review, and any questions that you may have, we will be glad to answer. But I will first give a brief overview of each one, and then I can open up that one for any questions that you may have. So the first one that we will talk about is the Cannabis 4AP Chemical Test Validation Summary. This validation summary describes the experiments that were performed to evaluate the 4AP chemical test. During the validation, it was demonstrated that this does not measure the amount of THC present in a plant material sample, but more it is based on the ratio of THC and CBD concentrations. In general, if the concentration of THC is greater than CBD, the color result is blue. And if the THC concentration is less than CBD, the color result will be pink. There is an inconclusive range for that test that should be noted that is between a THC to CBD ratio of 0.3 to 3. The majority of our experiments were performed in a spot well plate. And we evaluated neat standards, varying ratios of THC and CBD, along with other cannabinoids. And then additionally, several plant material samples were evaluated, including hemp and marijuana samples, as well as herbs. The validation indicated that the chemical test, the 4AP chemical test, is a viable screening option within an analytical testing scheme for evaluating plant material samples for the differentiation of marijuana and hemp. So at this time, if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Maureen or Jamie, do you have any questions about the 4AP chemical tests?
The only question I had when I was reading through it is that when you did the evaluation of interferences for spices. You only did it once, at least because it says it's for completed a single analysis for 16 different spices. Why only one time? Why not try it a couple of times just to make sure that you're getting a consistent result?
Our laboratory just did it one time to help just confirm the results that the DEA obtained as well. So this validation was actually a collaboration that we had with DEA, and we were both kind of performing the same experiments. And they performed some other experiments that are not within our validation, but we were presenting only our data within our validation summary, within our validations.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. You know, coming from I'm the outsider in this one, so I don't know the ins and outs of what else has been done. Mm-hmm. But thank you for clarifying that for me.
No problem.
All right. Do you have any specific questions?
This is Jamie. I didn't have any specific questions on this one.
All righty. And I had no real questions. I read a lot of this material over the last few months. I will just note a typo in the supplemental field, the Cannabis 4 AP chemical test document on page 2 of 8, under the evaluation of reference materials, titration analysis. It just says figure 1 illustrates the color results at each THC concentration. It should say illustrates, it says alliterates.
Perfect, thank you for finding that.
But everything else looks fine and looks good. But so I had no other questions for that. Let's see here. So any other, I guess that's all of that for that validation. So I guess we'll go ahead and talk about the next one, and then we'll put them all together as a vote at the end, is how we'll handle this.
Sounds great. So I will move on to the semi-quantitative analysis of total THC using GCFID. So this validation summary describes the experiments performed during the validation of our semi-quantitative method for the differentiation of marijuana and hemp. During the validation, a decision point was evaluated for the ratio of THC to internal standard. This is a total THC evaluation due to the decarboxylation in the injection port of the instrument. The decision initially evaluated was the ratio of 1, with additional experiments to evaluate the decision point ratio of 2 later on in the supplementals. A ratio of greater than 2 indicates the positive result for marijuana, but a ratio that is less than 2 would indicate an inconclusive result for marijuana or hemp. The method is considered to be semi-quantitative because the ratio corresponds to the evaluation of a sample of a 1% or 2% THC standard. So we are able to obtain some information regarding the concentration. All samples used in the evaluation of the previously mentioned 4 AP chemical test are also used within this validation as well. And then 2 additional round-robin studies were conducted that were both previously extracted samples that were analyzed at one laboratory and sent out to other laboratories. And then the second round-robin study was for each laboratory to perform the extraction themselves and analyze the samples. A stability study for the ratio over the duration of multiple laboratories, multiple instruments over various days was performed to help obtain the acceptance criteria for our 2%, our decision point. An interference study and evaluation of a high CBD concentration sample was also performed within this validation. The extraction procedure, only something to note of this extraction procedure is that there is no pre-processing of the plant material sample itself. And we are using androstenedione as the internal standard with a 9:1 methanol chloroform used for the extraction. The samples are allowed to incubate for 15 minutes at standard laboratory conditions prior to being vortexed for analysis. Does anyone have any questions about that validation summary?
I have no questions this morning.
Jamie, do you have anything?
So I just want some clarification on the agenda. So there's two. Were there two semi-quant that we're looking at then?
Yes, so there is one semi-quant method that is the GCFID for plant material. That's the validation summary.
Okay.
And then the other one is the alternative matrices, and that is our validation plan for one that we are currently working on.
Okay, I understand. So this is the validation summary, and I had floated some questions to Robin on this one, but just for the benefit of the committee, I'll go ahead and kind of talk. Some of the questions were sample prep. And there was some of my questions because were basically around the once the validation was completed, what kind of training the analysts received, how was there competency testing, more of a quality assurance point of view than the validation point of view. So I was happy with the answers that were given on that there was familiarization that was provided to the analyst on that. I did have a question on sample prep because it sounded like there was different ways that they could go and whether or not that was considered in the validation and whether or not it would there as a follow-up then when the procedure was written, whether or not that was a consideration. And that was because it wasn't addressed in the procedure that was online for the DFS's website. But I think that is it am I correct, Robin, that there wasn't because it was semi-quantitative, there wasn't direction, there wasn't any specific way that you wanted it done that you found out was best?
With regards to the sample prep, all
Right.
of the procedures in the procedures manual were written such that the examiners followed those specific instructions. So there wasn't anything outside of what was written in the procedures manual that they are required or asked to do.
Okay, so drying isn't necessary. It could go with however it's received. Is that correct?
So per their training and education, they will see a sample if it is deemed wet. Sorry, they will put that into a drying cabinet or in the hood in order for it to be dry prior to their analysis. And that's part of their procedure, even outside of the 2% method.
Okay.
So, Jamie, during the validation, there was no drying procedures performed specific to the validation itself. The one thing that you may be referring to is the beginning section with the method development, where it stated plucking versus grinding and those different factors. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I'm trying to refresh my memory by looking at the email, and there was a couple of things, but that was one of them, the plucking versus the
grinding and
other ways that might be performed.
so initially we looked at plucking versus grinding and sonicating. And those results, if you have the validation summary up, it's on page 3 of 11 in table 1. You can see the results of those based on the ratio of THC to internal standard for the 4 different samples that we evaluated.
Okay.
The plucking that's basically just taking a sampling from the actual plant itself without performing any sort of other sample preparation noted. Grinding would be with the mortar and pestle. And then grinding and sonicating would be you grind with a mortar and pestle and then put your sample in the sonicator. We chose to do the quote unquote kind of plucking technique because that is kind of the simplest simplest process to select your sample itself. And therefore, I think that's where you were potentially looking at the procedures manual. And so you weren't seeing the grinding and sonicating or anything of that nature because none of that is necessary to be performed.
Right. So that didn't need to be added to the procedures for that.
Correct.
And I think my other question was I didn't see it in the training manual yet, and that's in under revision.
Correct.
But I didn't have any other issues. I mean, any concerns with the validation itself. No questions.
Okay, I just have one question on page 4 or 5 under the establishing the control acceptance criteria. It looks like each lab, were there several labs and those lines straight across, were they specific locations that had really tight replications?
Yes, so if you are looking at the supplemental section 2, chart 1,
Yeah.
The actual order that's put in is actually by laboratory and in many ways, as you noted. So the 40 to 60 mark, that is one laboratory, 60 to 80 is another laboratory. These were all initially done with single instruments at each laboratory to help establish that acceptance criteria. So you can see that from 40 to 60, they are significantly tighter with less variability than the beginning portion, which is interesting. So we have, since this point too, we are control charting the 2% standard and also a 1% standard to continuously chart the variability, and it is color coded at this point so that each laboratory is a different color on the same chart, so we can see the variability across our entire laboratory system and then also by each laboratory individually.
Okay. All right. Very good. Yeah, I have no other questions for that. All right, so we can go on to semi-quantitative analysis of the total THC and alternative matrices.
Okay, so I apologize for that potentially being a little bit confusing. We have several different validations going on, and once one validation stops, we start extending that procedure to other sample types. And so this is a fine example of that, where we are now trying to use the GC-FID semi-quantitative analysis method for alternative matrices. We are just simply trying to extend that GC-FID MS method so that we can look at oils, hexane immiscible liquids, winterized hash oil, cold extract, keef, and then also cartridge contents from electronic cigarettes. So we were anticipating the high concentrations of THC that would be in all of these matrix types, which would be in the more 80% range approximately. So that we knew we had to do a change into that procedure, and therefore we went ahead and performed the extraction as written in the procedures manual, and then perform a 1 to 10 dilution prior to injecting on the instrument itself. Once the ratio of total THC to internal standard is obtained, there is a 10-fold multiplication factor to get back to your actual sample ratio itself. That is actually going to be applied using a macro that we have developed. So that's not something that's going to need to be done mathematically by every examiner. So within this validation, to validate this, there are a couple different things associated with it, including the fact that we know in these matrices in particular, we have a better chance of seeing different isomers. And therefore, we could identify within our GC-FID-MS method that we may have some co-eluting isomers. Our GC-FID-MS method uses 2 different columns, and therefore the isomers can be identified on the mass spec, but they co-elute on the FID. So in an instance where we may see an isomer, we would be able to put that on one of our previously validated isomer methods that we have within the department existing already. And so we wanted to not only validate our existing semi-quantitative analysis method for alternative matrices, but if an interference, whether it is an isomer or some other compound that is interfering with the THC or internal standard, that we can then also validate a secondary GC-FID method for the analysis of isomers that we previously validated. So with that, our experiments include sensitivity, reproducibility, a significantly large round-robin study, and the evaluation of alternative matrices, including interferences. So our round-robin study actually, in a way, encompassed all aspects of the validation. Our samples were extracted. We were able to obtain each of those matrices types indicated that I've already indicated. And from that, we were able to extract those, including a 2% and a 1% standard. And we sent those to each laboratory pre-extracted, and they actually ran those samples as well over multiple days with multiple replicates. So that is kind of what the validation is indicating, or a validation plan, and what we're currently working on. The other one big aspect of this is to look at testosterone as a potential alternative internal standard to androstenedione. So that is actually included in this validation plan as well. So the current phase of this is where we're evaluating that round robin data. Do you have any questions or suggestions of other experiments for our validation plan itself?
Jamie, do you have anything in particular?
Just to clarify, so when this is completed, when the validation is completed, I noticed you sent the extractions to the other labs. Would they be then doing the extractions on their own? And does that come into play as far as is entering into some kind of uncertainty with that?
So for this method, it is the exact same procedure as what they are performing currently. So everyone has been significantly trained on that, with the exception of just a 1 to 10 dilution.
Okay.
And so the procedures manual will be updated to include the ability to do these alternative matrices. And so since this is just a decision point determination of, once again, the marijuana, if it's greater than our decision point, or inconclusive if it is lower than our decision point, we wouldn't actually have an uncertainty of measurement within there.
Sure. That's why I was being careful not to use that word, but there might, but there might still be some kind of a
Variability.
range that you know that may come into play, but you may not be concerned as concerned about it, because I think your decision point is pretty high above what that legal limit is. Is that correct?
So the decision point actually for this method is the same exact decision point as our current existing method. And therefore the variability of that decision point will remain unchanged.
Okay.
That's the one thing that is nice about this, that variability is captured and continuously being captured.
I don't have any other questions.
Okay, Maureen, do you have any questions?
I do not.
Okay, and I don't either. I'm fine. Thanks. And then finally the cannabis plant material drying and decarboxylation study plan.
Okay, so drying and decarboxylation plan. This plan was written and intended to assess cannabis plant material drying procedure, and also a decarboxylation procedure. This plan, essentially the drying and decarboxylation are two separate entities. We wanted to ensure that the plant material was dry prior to decarboxylation. Although both of those have temperatures associated with them, they are very different temperatures with different lengths of time. Therefore, the drying procedure itself, we obtained several different samples. So the plan was to look at plant material samples that were of a low THC concentration with a high THC acid, equal THC to THC acid, and low THC or high THC with low THC acid. Sorry about that. We wanted to obtain enough of each sample type to evaluate for both drying and decarboxylation. And so our first experiments were evaluating a drying procedure at 40 degrees C. We took one sample set out of each of those 3 different types of samples, and we put them in a desiccator for 24 hours while recording the weight pre and post desiccation. Those were at standard laboratory conditions, no heating. Then 24 hours at 40 degrees C, weighing the sample before going into the oven, and then they were taken out of the oven, cooled, and reweighed. Then those samples were returned back to the oven for 1 hour, where then after that subsequent time period, they were removed and reweighed. The final experiment was 40 degrees C for 16 hours, weighing prior to putting in the oven, and then after they came to room temperature after 16 hours, and then 2 4-hour increments, looking at the percent difference in the weight at each time point to see if that weighing procedure or that drying procedure was significantly drying the samples, or if there was a lot of weight change. Understanding that the majority of the samples that we obtain within DFS are already submitted as being brittle, dry samples. These were case type samples. We did not want to use any samples that were going to be any sort of pre-processing or significantly old samples to maybe skew the actual representation of those samples itself. So once the drying procedure was evaluated, we would move on to the decarboxylation plan. Actually, let me go back first and mention that once the samples were done and dry from their drying procedure, we did analyze those on the HPLC to monitor for the THC, THCA, CBD, and also CBN as a degradation product, so that we could ensure that we were not degrading our samples by putting them into the oven. And those were compared to the desiccator for 24 hours, since no heat was applied to those samples. So moving on to the decarboxylation, we wanted to evaluate the decarboxylation of THCA to THC using those same plant material samples, so that we had a variety of concentrations of THC acid and THC itself, so that we could not only evaluate the decarboxylation, but also monitor, once again, that degradation of potentially THC to CBN. The evaluation was going to be performed in both an oven and a heat block to see which heating procedure was, to see if each heating procedure produced the same results, and or if one over the other was faster or easier to use for the scientist itself for later implementation. The oven and heat block will both be evaluated at different temperatures and different times. And then we would also do a % difference of the THC acid from each temperature and each time point itself. The decarboxylation procedure is performed a couple steps into the process. So the plant material would be put in the oven at the 40°C for drying, with weighing pre and post to ensure that there is no significant change in the weight of the sample itself. After that, the sample would be put into a grinding mill. The sample will be ground with the grinding mill that has individual disposable cups with blades to help reduce any sort of potential need for cleaning and cross-contamination. The ground sample is then weighed, and a 100 milligram sampling is then what is actually getting the decarboxylation procedure itself. So we're not decarboxylating an unground plant material sample. The plant material sample is homogenized with the grinding, and then the decarboxylation is evaluated with that ground plant material sample. So this is another one that we are currently in progress, and we are actively working on to hopefully move towards, which is going to be our next point, is our methods that are in development for quantitative analysis. Does anyone have any questions or suggestions?
This is Maureen. The only question that I had is that when I read through the procedure, it sounded like you were only going to be doing this one time. But in listening to you explain it, it sounds like you're actually doing this, multiple times to check and make sure that you're getting the same answer each time. Am I correct in that assumption from what you're saying, that it's actually being done multiple times?
So you're actually correct in the fact that we are only doing this. There is only one replicate for each plant material type, and we have 3 different plant material types. Given the quantity that is required, it is challenging to be able to do a significant number of replicates. But these experiments are the preliminary for the validation itself. So then once we decide on which temperatures to use for everything, the validation will be performed with the established decarboxylation and drying procedures and will be evaluated throughout our whole validation process.
Well, I know that you're typically getting material that is pretty brittle, as you put it, which is not at all surprising to me. But I do wonder, if you got in something that ended up being particularly moist relative to what you're experimenting with, is it possible that the drying would not be enough? I mean, are you going to like overshoot the actual drying point to accommodate things that are moister than what you're experimenting with, or do you have a plan for something like that?
Yes, and I realize that you can't see me shaking my head. Yes, whenever you are talking, but absolutely. So we do know that the majority of our samples are brittle whenever they do come in, but based on the examiner's experience and training, they will put their samples into a drying cabinet and or the hood for drying prior to any of this experimentation or once the method is online. If they get a young plant material sample in, or a plant material sample that was, say, freshly pulled from a hemp field, the examiner would note that this is a fresh and or damp plant material sample, either from actually physically you and me being able to tell that, or under microscopic evaluations to have even indications of mold will help them kind of differentiate that maybe this sample may be a little bit wet from the mold growth. Oh, hi. So what they will do is they will indicate those samples and they will automatically put those samples into the drying cabinet, and those are not exposed to any temperature at all. They're standard laboratory conditions. And then they would be performing this drying procedure if they were to move forward to the quantitative analysis.
So they're going to do that after it's sat in a drying cabinet for a while?
Yes, correct. So they should all be brittle by the time that they would be going into the oven for drying for this procedure.
Okay. I'm a little concerned that they would, that in that pre-drying phase, that they actually will get to the same, level of dryness that, you have with the samples that are typically coming in pretty brittle. But, I'm not really sure how you will get around that. The only suggestion I would have would be to experiment with some of these, these fairly moist materials and see if you can figure out what your worst case scenario is.
Yes, so we actually were able to obtain, and this might be helpful for you, is we were able to obtain some samples from our state hemp growers. And those were freshly harvested samples that they submitted to another laboratory that we were able to then obtain, that were just fresh clippings that were put into brown paper bags for us. And for storage, we had to put them in a drying cabinet. Actually, they remained in the brown paper bag itself and were placed in the drying cabinet and allowed to dry for 2 days. And they were extremely brittle after that point. And then we have since had them in the refrigerator for drying. So we do have that sample type that you're describing that we will be evaluating during the validation.
So I guess my only suggestion would be that you weigh that and make sure that you've pretty much come to the end point. So if you think you're pretty much at the end point of dryness in that drying cabinet, wait another time, another amount of time, whatever you decide is reasonable, 24 hours, 1 week, whatever. Weigh it again, see if there's any significant change. If there's no significant change, then yeah, you have reached the end point on that and you're probably ready to go. But I mean, you might want to have a handle on what that end point is.
Yes, I agree. And we also will be weighing before and after being placed in the oven. And if there is greater than a 10% difference in weight after that 24-hour or 16-hour, whichever designated time frame for drying in the oven is, if there's greater than a 10% difference in the weight pre and post, it will go back into the oven for 4 hours, and then you will have weighing again, a difference between the, say, 16-hour point and that additional 4 hours, to then show that there is a less than a 10% difference in weight as well. So we will have a procedure for, if it isn't significantly dry, we do get to a point where we have stabilized and are less than a 10% weight difference.
That seems reasonable.
Thank you.
I don't have any questions. Jamie?
Okay. Okay, so do you have criteria now for that pre-drying step you were talking about when a chemist gets it in and dries it? Or is this to determine that, or like I'm missing
Oh, so
something?
sorry. The crazy delay. Sorry, we seem to be freezing.
Okay.
Have your videos on?
Might be.
This is Linda. Currently in the procedures,
Rich,
there's
here to
Are we okay?
I'm sorry, this is Alco. We're having a little connectivity issue here. We can't, you guys are breaking up with your
Linda was coming across. Are you back, Linda?
yes. I was just going to answer the question in that in the procedure there is not a particular cutoff or anything like that, any measurement that's taken of knowing when to put material into the drying cabinet. It's just part of the training process, where if fresh plant material or plant material that is wet in some way comes in, then examiners are taught and then know to put that material into the drying cabinet in order to have it come to a more static weight before taking a measurement for the weight.
There's a delay.
He's muted.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Rich, you appear muted.
So I am. Okay. Sorry about that. So you don't have the ovens set to any particular temperature, or that must be in a procedure somewhere, right? You put them in an oven that is like at 50 degrees or 80 degrees or something like that, or
So the dry
figure that out.
for this particular, this is Linda, for this particular validation plan that she is talking about, this for the drying for this method of quantitating THC, that is what they're looking into. Is they're looking at different scenarios of how to treat the plant material.
Okay.
And those are defined, the temperatures.
Got it. Okay. That's all. I'm good. I have no other questions. Alrighty, so that is all of the, so that's all 4 validations, right, that we've discussed. Have we, I guess, have there been any particular recommendations that we have put forward that we're going to incorporate? Would you mind, I guess, just rehashing anything that we talked about that you're going to change, if anything in particular?
So for the 4 AP, just the typo fix for sure. And then I think we took care of Jamie's questions about that she previously had about the training and competencies, sample preparation with the drying and plucking and grinding and those types of steps in the process. And then I think that for the current one that we just talked about for the decarboxylation and drying, to make sure that we are clearly defining, especially in the validation plan, the drying procedures and thresholds associated with weighing before, weighing after, putting in the oven. And then if there is less than a 10% change, we can move forward in weight. But if there is a greater than 10% change, these are the actionable items that you have to follow.
Okay, that sounds good. All right then, so now that we've discussed all the validations, I guess I'll ask for a motion to close the review of these validations. From one of my,
Maureen, I move to close the review.
already a second.
This is Jamie, I second.
Already, and then Ms. Taylor, can you please do a roll call vote?
Okay. Maureen,
Aye.
Rich,
Aye.
Jamie.
Aye.
Okay, the motion passes.
Alrighty, thank you. Alrighty, so the next thing on our agenda is the discussion of methods and developments. And so we use the same process we did before, and I'll ask Ms. Weimer or Dr. Wagner to lead the discussion for these methods and developments.
Okay, this is Becky. I will just briefly go over the 3 different projects that we have in development right now for controlled substances, so that you are aware of the wonderful documents that you will be reviewing in the near future. And the first one I will start with is the quantitative analysis of THC, THCA, and CBD using HPLC. So this method is intended for the quantitative analysis of cannabinoids in plant material samples to help us further differentiate between hemp and marijuana. This is a quantitative test as opposed to our GC-FID-MS semi-quantitative test. This will be for those, specifically for those inconclusive results that give us a ratio less than our decision point with the GC-FID. This method in particular is an extraction with plant material itself. During the validation, we are going to be evaluating the decarboxylation of THCA to THC to be able to report out a total THC concentration. But during the validation, our intention where we have enough sample is to analyze both a decarboxylated sample and a sample that has not been decarboxylated to validate for that THC acid as well concentration. So we would be able to do both with this method, report out a total THC or report out a THC concentration and a THCA concentration. The CBD in and of itself is a slight carryover from our existing HPLC quantitative method that we do have in our procedures manual at this time for oil samples. So we will be just further evaluating that with this method as well. Do you have any questions for that one?
I have no questions.
Maureen,
So this is Jamie. So where is this in the process then?
So once we have a method right now that is in development, and we do have a pretty solid contender for our instrumental parameters as well as our sample preparation technique. The thing that we are relying on is the completion of the drying and decarboxylation study before we can move on to the validation itself. We do have a validation plan that has been written and is in review currently internally. So that once the drying and decarboxylation plan is complete and written up, that we will be able to move forward to the validation itself.
Okay, thank you. So you currently have a quantitative procedure, but it's not used for plant materials? Is that what I heard?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
And Maureen, you said you had no questions?
That's correct.
Okay. Alrighty. Okay, let's move on to then the quantitative analysis of THC, THCA, CBD using GCFID.
Okay, so the quantitative analysis using GCFID is going to be very similar to the quantitative analysis method for HPLC. This will be for the total THC concentration, but we will be planning on doing a decarboxylation step prior to injection onto the instrumentation, although we know that the instrument itself will cause decarboxylation. We will be performing decarboxylation pre-analysis so that it is in a more controlled environment. And the actual intent of both this and the HPLC method are to evaluate both quantitative procedures to be able to identify a procedure that is best fit for the department. And the hope is that both of these methods can be validated in essence in a tandem or in parallel, not in tandem. And we can have the experiments performed with the same exact samples to be able to do a comparative analysis of the two.
So are you only planning on having one actually operational method, or you're going to have LC and GC available?
I believe that will be to be determined in the future, depending on the results of the validations themselves.
Okay. All right, any other questions for that one?
Maureen, I have no questions.
It's Jamie. I have no questions.
Okay. Very good. Then moving on to confirmation of THCA using tandem mass spec.
Okay, so this once again is kind of an extension of all things hemp. The THCA, if we end up going with HPLC quantitation and we do not decarboxylate our samples prior to analysis on the HPLC, we will have both THCA and THC quantitative values, but we will not have confirmation of that THC acid itself because it does decarboxylate in the injection port of any of our confirmation techniques within controlled substances at this time. So we are taking a little bit of an investigative approach and a different way of thinking by having a confirmation method using tandem mass spectrometry to confirm the THC acid itself, because tandem mass spectrometry, specifically LC-MS-MS, will not decarboxylate the sample within the ionization of the instrument. It uses electrospray ionization, which is a soft ionization technique. It will be able to fragment and have a controlled fragmentation of the THC acid itself. And we will be able to confirm the THCA's identity within our technique. We also have in the front end of this instrument, we have the liquid chromatography as well to allow for separation of the THCA from any potential isomers or interference that may hinder our confirmation. So we do have, this is in the phase of, we do have a method that has been developed, and we have a validation plan that has been written and in the internal review process. So our intention is, once we are ready to validate the HPLC and GCFID quantitative methods, we will take some of those samples that are utilized from that extraction, and it is a 1 to 500 dilution that will be performed for confirmation within the tandem mass spectrometer, among several other experiments. I guess I should qualify that one with interference studies and all of those other decision point experiments.
Alrighty, any questions?
This is Jamie. No questions?
Maureen, no questions.
And I don't have any either. So at this point, I guess since we have no really questions or comments as far as these methods are concerned, can I have a motion to close the review of these methods in development?
I move to close the meeting.
Review. Jamie seconds.
I second.
Alrighty, Ms. Taylor, roll call please.
Okay. Maureen,
Aye.
Rich,
Aye.
Jamie.
Aye.
Okay, the motion passes.
Alrighty, the next item in our agenda is public comments. Are there any members of the public present? I see none on my list of participants. Unless it's anybody local in Alka's shop. She has a lot of people in her room.
I do have in this room Dr. David Barron with me, in addition to Dr. Wagner and Ms. Weimer, just so
Okay.
I don't think that was taken for the role at the beginning of the meeting.
Okay, no problem. All right, so there appears to be no public presence. So this concludes the agenda, and I will ask for a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I move to adjourn the
Go
meeting.
I second. Jamie?
Alrighty, and Ms. Taylor, can you please take a roll call?
All right, Maureen,
Aye.
Rich,
Aye.
Jamie.
Aye.
All right, it passes.
So the motion passes. The meeting is adjourned. That's
Hey.
it. Thank you all. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
I was going to say, this is Linda. I just want to thank you